you? Welcome to LSB Feaster's radio channel and travel corner, where our mission in life is keeping great radio from the past alive. And today we're going to Pennsylvania and KDKA Pittsburgh. Hard to believe the station signed on about 100 years ago if you're watching this in 2020. They began life in 1916 as an experimental station. But then in October 1920, they went to the government for the nation's first commercial broadcast license. They got it, and then on November 2nd, 1920, KDKA went on the air at 8 p.m. and began broadcasting presidential election returns. And radio, as we know it today, was born. After 100 years, KDKA is still one of the top stations in Pittsburgh, and it's been through several different incarnations. I mean, originally it was a local station, then it went to being a network station carrying all the network shows and comedies and dramas. In the 1950s, it evolved into an MOR station, you know, keeping people updated with the news, but playing a lot of the softer songs of the day. And then in the 1970s, it started evolving into a talk and information station, which it remains today. And what we have for you today is something cool. It's a broadcast from November 2nd, 1985, as KDKA celebrates its 65th anniversary. So kind of nice to take a look back, especially right now that we're taking a look back at KDKA celebrating its 100th birthday. Anyway, if you like what you hear, feel free to give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel if you like it, and feel free to smack that bell. When you do, you'll be notified whenever we post anything new. All right, let's go back to November 2nd, 1985, as we celebrate KDKA's 65th anniversary.
He arranged with the Hamilton Music Store of Wilkinsburg to supply records in exchange for announcements of the store's name. Thus, the Hamilton Music Store became the world's first radio advertiser. H.P. Davis, Westinghouse vice president, soon realized that a real radio industry lay in the manufacture of home receivers, and regular radio programs would make people want to own such receivers. Thus, a license was secured, and election night, 1920, was selected for the first regular broadcast.
Some 30 million Americans are electing a president of the United States, a vice president, 34 United States senators.
After that first broadcast, there were many other KDKA firsts to come, spurred by an ambitious programming policy maintained by KDKA to this day. The plan called for programs of interest to the greatest number, distinctive feature programs scheduled at regular times, daily radio service, avoidance of monotony, and all of these promises led KDKA to break new ground.
The first thing we did was the Sunday morning services at the Calvary Episcopal Church in Pittsburgh. And in order to operate the switches, we had to have a point where we could see what was going on. So we put the switchboard in the choir. In order to be in the choir, we had to wear the choir robes. And I alternated with Jack Fraser, who was the head of the telephone department, who was a Catholic, and myself. I'm Jewish, so we were in an Episcopal church. And sometimes when we were there, we'd sing along with the choir.
That January 1921 church broadcast also marked the world's first remote pickup. In fact, 1921 was a year of many firsts, including the hiring of the world's first full-time radio announcer.
I heard they were building this transmitting station, and I went up to see it just through curiosity. And while I was up there, I found out that they were looking for a regular announcer. And I said, well, I'd like to try that. So they let me try it, and apparently I was satisfactory. So I thought I'd do that for maybe a few days or a few weeks, and it ended up I was there 5 years.
Harold W. Arlen also helped write the early history of sports broadcasting when on August 5th, 1921, he first broadcast a Forbes Field match between the Pirates and the Phillies.
To me, it was just like watching a regular ball game and announcing what happened. If we had known that we were really starting a history, we'd have made some notes.
Did you broadcast the play-by-play like they do today, or was it different?
No, we do it pretty much like they do today, except we didn't have all the statistics.
The Pirates won the game 8-5. It was here that listeners first heard a World Heavyweight Championship fight. KDKA first carried tennis play-by-play, the Davis Cup matches of 1921, and it was here that KDKA listeners heard the world's first Radio World Series, the Yankees and Giants from the Polo Grounds. Football play-by-play was born on KDKA when we aired the Pitt, West Virginia gridiron match on October 8, 1921. Pitt won it, 21-13. There were dozens more breakthroughs from the world's pioneer station, but the story of radio was just beginning. Our programming policies were beginning to cause some growing pains.
As you know, we just had a little shack up on the, and only played phonograph music. So in order to get live entertainment, we built a studio right next to the radio station.
The rooftop tent studio in East Pittsburgh caused some early problems for the performers, as Harold Arlen recalls.
This soprano soloist came out all dressed up in evening clothes. She looked beautiful. But right in the middle of her song, a Pennsylvania train went by and blew a great cloud of smoke and soot all over her hair, her face, and her dress. She just kept on singing through the smoke and soot and finally finished her song.
Early KDKA fans still recall the whistle of that passing freight train, which became a regular 8:30 p.m. feature no matter what the program. Our early radio schedule kept expanding. A program schedule of 1922, edited by Leo Rosenberg, lists a regular church program, the Uncle Wiggily bedtime stories for the kids, regular hourly news, weather, and announcements of the correct time. The KDKA Little Symphony Orchestra was the first of many musical groups on the station. By now, all of radio was growing fast. More than 500 broadcast stations were licensed in 1922. Meanwhile, in the Westinghouse laboratories, Dr. Conrad and others were still busy, developing technology to bring the world such marvels as radar, FM radio, and television, and shortwave radio. Soon, a shortwave radio transmitter joined the KDKA transmitter on the East Pittsburgh rooftop, and the new equipment carried the programs worldwide. It wasn't long before KDKA inaugurated our famed Far North service. The Far North service was for many years the one personal connection to civilization for hundreds of missionaries, traders, Canadian Mounted Police, and others.
Good evening. This is Bill Beal welcoming you once again to the regular Saturday evening program of Messages to the Far North. Well, here's tonight's first letter. It's to Alfred Cargill, Hudson's Bay Post at Moose Factory, James Bay, from your brother in Denver, Colorado. Alf, you will be happy to hear that Tom has pulled through the Operation Fine.
1925 marked the creation of National Broadcasting Networks, and KDKA joined the National Broadcasting Company as a member of the Blue Network. Coast-to-coast radio entertainers were becoming household words. Billy Jones and Ernie Hare were two early radio singing stars heard on KDKA.
How do you do, everybody? How do you do? Gee, it's great to say hello to all of you. I'm Billy Jones. I'm Ernie Hare. We're the interwoven pair. How do you do?
In 1928, KDKA moved its studios into the William Penn Hotel. Rudy Valley, Eddie Cantor, Paul Whiteman, and many more all were heard on KDKA. And as radio's first decade came to a close, radio had become the cheerful friend during the dark days of the Depression, as the collapse of vaudeville created the new radio vaudeville era.
Evening, friends, family, pardon me, ladies and gentlemen. This is station OUCH of the New Writers Broadcast.
As radio became more sophisticated, so did the commercials. Singing commercials became much more common.
Pepsi Cola, it's the spot. 12 full ounces, that's a lot. Twice as much for a nickel, too. Pepsi Cola is the drink for you.
Have you tried Wheaties? J-E-L-L-O. Tasty yeast is tempting to your appetite. Creamy, wholesome candy, try a luscious bite. You will see them growing stronger every day. Taste
this dandy, handy candy way.
In 1934, KDKA moved to new spacious studios in Pittsburgh's Grant Building. Evenings on KDKA featured the shows on the National Broadcasting Company network. The radio medium continued to demonstrate its superiority as a means of instantaneous news coverage, as heard in this famous 1930s eyewitness report of the Hindenburg disaster.
Just enough to keep it from... It bursts into flames. Wait, get out of the way. Get this, Charlie. It's fighting, and it's crashing. It's crashing terrible. Oh, my. Get out of the way, please. It's burning and bursting into flames, and it's falling on the mooring mast, and all the folks between us. This is terrible. This is one of the worst catastrophes in the world.
One famous radio news reporter began his career at KDKA just a few years earlier.
Now, Lowell Thomas.
Good evening, everybody, and thanks a lot, Hugh. I appreciated it all the more because another DuPont Award was made at the same time, given to what the committee considered the high-powered radio station that had done the most outstanding work for the past year. That station, KDKA, where I had my very first broadcasting experience just 21 years ago.
In 1933, a national banking crisis led the president to use radio's intimate form of communication to talk to the nation. FDR's fireside chats were the forerunners of today's weekly radio addresses by President Reagan.
Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
But KDKA radio's biggest test was to come in 1936, when the great Pittsburgh flood forced the station to move from the Grant Building to emergency studios atop a hill while broadcasting went on.
Pittsburgh, the heart of the metropolitan area that houses millions of people, is now living in the midst of conditions that have suddenly shoved the entire community back to horse and buggy days. We saw our usually peaceful and picturesque rivers, the Allegheny, Monongahela, and Ohio, suddenly changed to ugly, swirling, muddy monsters.
1937 marked the 17th anniversary of KDKA Radio. The station noted the event with a special broadcast from the William Penn Hotel that dramatically demonstrated how quickly radio had advanced in just a few years.
At this moment, we are going to duplicate briefly a typical broadcast of those early days. You, our guests of the air, and our many guests here in the urban room of the William Penn Hotel in Pittsburgh are witness to this. As a small group of musicians, familiar to those who listened 17 years ago, play Avalon, a hit melody of 1920, and play it over the very same carbon microphones used on those initial broadcasts.
Period of 17 years, engineering progress has outdated the 1920 microphone from which I am now speaking. Radio has made giant strides forward. In sharp contrast to the Avalon of 1920, played by the 8-piece group, comes the Avalon of 1937, with 60 of Pittsburgh's finest musicians under the leadership of Dr. Frank Black, musical director of the National Broadcasting Company. You hear it through the most modern of radio equipment.
All of radio was entering a new era, the era of big network radio shows. Coast-to-coast radio was growing, and the crystal set and wireless telephone of the 20s had given way to the big friendly Philco, RCA, or Westinghouse radio in the family room. Evening was radio time, when listeners across the country would gather in front of the glowing dial for their favorite shows. And it's because of radio's power to enlist the imagination that many of yesteryear's radio programs remain fresher in the memory than last year's television shows.
Sam Spade Detective Agency.
Guiding light. Hello, Duffy's Tavern. Where do you lead me,
Good evening, friends of the inner sanctum.
Lux presents
Bob broadcasting from
Grand Central Station.
Yours truly, Johnny Dollar.
Captain Midnight.
Who knows what evil?
Yes, it was a golden age of entertainment, and the 30s ended with the promise of great things to come. But overseas, there were rumblings that would soon explode into world conflict.
Berlin. Adolf Hitler has warned the League that if sanctions are invoked against Italy, Germany will not observe them. Germany, which has given up membership...
December 7th, 1941 arrived much too soon.
Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor.
A date which will live in infamy.
America was at war, and here in Pittsburgh, the home front did its part.
A big 18-ounce can of V8 vegetable juices takes only 2 ration points.
You know, my husband's in a munitions factory now, and he gets his work shirts extra greasy.
Well, my wife says Mrs. Davis down the road has lots of wartime work shirts to wash, too.
We've had another week of air war. The greatest air war that the world has yet seen.
Every bulletin meant more information from over there, and the war left little untouched. KDKA's far north host, Bill Beal, explained.
I can remember being called into the manager's office with the previous week's letters and concern on his face, and somebody was there from, I suppose it was the FBI. Later, they said that they were being used by the Nazis to send messages to their cohorts in America.
Slim Bryant recalls those years.
I do remember the good old days when KDKA went to the bond rallies and all the public service work they did to help the government raise money, sow war bonds. All the KDKA staff with Bernie Armstrong and his group, and Mary Martha Browning, the Kinder sisters, and Buzz and Bill, and Faye Parker.
As usual, KDKA listeners were there when the need was great. During World War II, KDKA sold our listeners over $1 million in war bonds, both by huge outdoor bond wagon rallies and over the air to listeners in 31 states via mail order. Pittsburghers did their part and stayed by their radios. Listeners appreciated radio's ability to deliver instantaneous news of the battles overseas. But finally, the end of the war was in sight as radio bulletins came on a daily basis.
It is evident to us here in the NBC newsroom that the first phase of the invasion has been carried
and
through.
All Pittsburgh celebrated as Japan surrendered. KDKA's on-the-street reporter tried to describe the event over the noise of the celebration.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're celebrating, all Pittsburgh is celebrating the end of the war in the Pacific. We're down here at 4th and Grant trying to get the various opinions from the folks walking by. Everyone seems to be in town, and I'm not kidding. Those gas stations stand...
The war was finally over, and the country got about the business of getting back to life as normal. Radio got back to the job of entertaining and informing as radio's entertainers returned from the front.
Good evening, anybody. Here's more.
Would you like to be...
Daddy!
Oh, what is it?
Faster than a speeding bullet.
A while, let a song be your style, you
Mr. Anthony, are you ready for your first case?
Quite ready.
Eastern wartime. The Japanese have accepted our terms fully.
Gangbuster.
There was lots to do and see, and in Pittsburgh, that included Pittsburgh Pirates baseball. Those returning GIs couldn't wait to hear Rosie Rosewell.
Any day. There's a home run. You don't need to raise the window, Minnie. There it goes, clear right over the scoreboard. Over into Shenley Park, a round tripper for Ralph Kiner, his first of the 1948 season.
Oh, did he?
Let's hope that it's the first.
Bob Prince was one of those who helped Rosie with his special effects.
Rosie was the fellow that, if you knew his expressions, and they certainly did in Pittsburgh, they loved him very much. He was sort of the Edgar Guest of the baseball. Get up there, Aunt Minnie, raise the window, and the old Dipsy Doodle, and get up and put a handkerchief on his head. Of course, I had to stand up there with a tray full of cowbells and glass and everything. He'd blow the whistle, and he'd say, get up there, Aunt Minnie, and raise the window, and he'd blow the whistle, and he'd nod his head, and I'd drop the tray full of bologna, and all the debris go all over the studio. And then that sounded like breaking glass, and then he said, she never made it. Tripped over the garden hose. She never made it. A round tripper for Ralph Kiner.
Al Marsico's orchestra, Harry McCluskey and the Shag Level Cider Hounds, Bernie Armstrong and the KDKA Orchestra. These were just some of the musical groups on KDKA during the time.
For the orchestra selection tonight, Al Marsico has chosen Humoresque.
Evenings on KDKA featured live entertainment shows with studio audiences. Jeannie Baxter was a vocalist.
Maurice Batoni led the band on, I think it was Tuesday nights for Fort Pitt there.
And I was on Friday night with Bernie Armstrong, who was the leader, for Duquesne Beer. Of course, Paul Shannon was the announcer, and Mary Martha Briney, Maurice Batomley, and the Kinder Sisters.
It's tap time.
Yeah, I was on for Iron City Beer. Bill Hines was on for Fort Pitt. And Bernie Armstrong and the KDKA orchestra was on for Duquesne Beer. And they were the 3 half-hour shows in the evening.
His love is like a melody full of